All right. So as educators, we're constantly seeking ways to improve our teaching and to support the diverse needs of our student populations. This can be especially challenging in asynchronous classroom environments. So we asked the question, what if we could personalize education for every student, catering to their unique needs and learning styles? And with AI, that has become a reality. So today we're going to be exploring how AI can empower us to put our students at the center of the learning process. So yeah, go ahead, Craig.
Welcome, everyone. It's great to be with you. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Craig Brewer. I'm from Los Angeles Pacific University and just want to share a little bit about some of the exciting research that we've had the privilege of being part of. As many of you are aware of, there has been a lot of discussion and dialogue around the use of AI tools from an ethical perspective. And so as university administrators, we've been grappling with that to say, okay, how do we ensure that we're preparing our students for career success? So that's one of the highlights of LAPU is that our goal is to prepare students to really hit the ground running in whatever profession they're going to be in. And so for one of the particular programs we have, it's a Bachelor's of Arts in Applied Psychology. And the applied means it's not a research degree, it's application. And so in that particular degree, it's even more critical for us as an institution to be preparing students for career success. So one of the research articles that we're working on is looking at generative AI. And so the study is going to really examine the importance of equipping mental health professionals in training with the knowledge and skills needed to navigate AI-driven tools, ensuring that they're competent in leveraging AI to support their clients, while also nurturing students' spiritual and emotional well-being. And so from the Lit Review, we're seeing that in the field of mental health counseling, that there's a number of AI generative tools that clinicians are beginning to use. And so as an institution that has a goal of preparing students for career success, we've been grappling with how do we integrate some of those generative AI tools into our curriculum. So in the curriculum design process, what we have done is we begin thinking through different ways of doing that. And so for example, one way of doing that is looking at AI characters. So I'll give you an example. When we, in the field of psychology, in most programs, we have some type of practicum to prepare students for working with the population. And so for us, in some of those classes in the past, we haven't had the opportunity really for our students to work with children, for example, right? Just because it's an at-risk population, we're not going to expose training clinicians to working with children. So the thinking here is by using AI characters, we can develop an AI character that is in fact the child, and the student can go back and forth with that AI character and really learn the clinical skills that they need to learn while not putting any population at risk. So that's one of the things we're exploring right now as part of this article is using these AI characters and what that looks like. And then the advantage for students too in that is that they don't necessarily have to find someone to do the interview with. And so real practical tool, just one example of how we can integrate generative AI into our curriculum. Again, in hopes of giving students the ability to work with these tools and to ultimately be familiar with them. So when they do go into their profession, it won't be a learning curve. They'll have been familiar with the tools. And so we're working on integrating that. We're also looking as an institution on using generative AI in our curriculum development process in general as an institution. And so that's been a big move forward for us. As a matter of fact, even looking at subject matter experts, we're saying, okay, can we use generative AI to serve as a subject matter expert in some ways? And so we're trying to really take a step back. And as faculty, the other piece of this too is that if we're going to be training students to use the tools, we have to become more familiar with the tools as well. And so for me, in this past year, I've been personally just using a lot of tools and getting familiar with them, but I've been so impressed with some of the tools that we have that are available for us. As academics, it's a game changer. It's almost like, I remember, the calculator came out, and the calculator was a game changer for mathematics. This almost feels, as we look at generative AI, it's almost like a calculator for words. You can put paragraphs in. So I can take paragraphs, put them in and ask ChatGPT or another AI generative source to paraphrase that or summarize that or list it. It's just amazing at how much more efficient I can be as an academic by using some of these tools. So I've been learning that in this past year, and then trying to share that with my students too, to provide them with those tools.
Yeah. So back to what you were saying about the character AI, can you just speak a little bit more about how other sort of examples about how that's being used? I know that we were using that in our Psych 460 motivation class for motivational interviewing. So can you talk a little bit about how LAPU is sort of training these character AIs to serve these sort of different roles?
Absolutely. So, and that's part of the design process. And we have this group that works behind the scenes to make sure that I should clarify that when I talk about this, it's not just ChatGPT. This is us integrating in the curriculum and the content into the characters. And so by doing that, what ultimately we're doing is we can also safeguard the student experience to some extent as well by integrating that in on the back end. And so there's a lot of work that goes in behind the scenes to training or augmenting is the right word. We're doing augmentation. And with that training and augmenting, ultimately the hope in that is that we really do prepare students. And so another class is our interviewing techniques class that we offer. And that class is really focused on the practical application. So students interview one another and they're engaged in a lot of that. And so another example is we use something similar in that class where students may not have had the opportunity to connect with another student to do the interview. So we began piloting that as an alternative option for students. And we're just trying to assess and find ways to quantify the impact of that and the difference that it makes. But it's been a useful tool in situations where the student may not have had an option to connect with somebody else, or it might have been last minute or things didn't work out, to say, hey, here's another option for you that you can connect with.
Yeah. And one of the unique things about what we're doing, as you say, it's not just using a ChatGPT or a Google Gemini. These are specifically trained or augmented for the individual courses. Yes. So the course assistants that they use for a psych class would not be the same as for a history class or a comm class or a public health class. So it really gives students that like individually tailored education. Because I know, as you and I were talking about yesterday, in this sort of world of instant gratification, that students have an expectation of sort of instantaneous feedback. And professors can't always do that because, especially with our student population, they're working full-time jobs. They're often not working until midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning. And that's challenging because as a professor, you can't be on call, 24 hours a day. Whereas these teaching assistants that we have, can do that. So can you talk about how using these sort of teaching assistants that we have, how has that freed up your time and better used your time, would you say?
I've been using, I teach an intro to psych class that I've been teaching for years, term after term after term, every 8 weeks. And so we did a pilot in that class with the basically a chat bot, but it's not like you're talking about there. We call it Spark. So Spark is in the class and students can ask Spark anything. It's a generative AI tool. But as you pointed out, Kristen, it basically, when I connect with Spark in the class and I pose a question, I almost feel like I'm talking with the publisher or the author of the text, because it's not just sharing, it's not just pulling from Google. It's very different. It's pulling from the content that we've delivered in the class. And so what I ended up doing is I was trying to explore the class and say, how could this provide a benefit? Well, every term, students really struggle with applying theoretical models. And so in psychology, we apply a developmental approach and we apply these different approaches and models. And so I would oftentimes get emails from students saying, I'm not quite sure how to apply the model or what that looks like. Well, now I have the opportunity to say, well, why don't you check with Spark? have a dialogue with Spark about that. And so students did. And I would say, make sure you go back and forth at least 5 times. What I mean about going back and forth is Spark that we created doesn't just answer the question, it poses additional questions. So for students engaging with Spark, it's not like they're on their own doing this. Spark is actually asking them a follow-up question. And so it becomes a really rich dialogue. And it's surprising, even for me, about how it really kind of meets that need and that gap. So oftentimes students will do that. And then I'll say, hey, let's have a conversation now. And at that point, since they've already had an opportunity to work with Spark and have some of that dialogue, they come into the conversation with me already at a higher level. And so it just makes better use of my time as a faculty member to be able to engage with students who have already kind of grappled with the issues. Another thing that I found is that for some of our students, there's different ways of learning. And for some of our students, one of the things that they say, and we've got this for a long time as an online institution, many students say, well, so much of it's is reading and writing, and I want to learn in different ways, and I want it to be more dynamic. And so this is a great way of doing that, because now instead of just reading something, what they're doing is they're engaging with the Spark, and it's more dynamic. And I think it's a generational thing too, Kristen. For many of our students, they're familiar with Google, and they have a question, they put it into Google and they get a response. Yeah. And so I think for those digital native students, it's just really simple and convenient. And so the feedback that I've gotten as I've done that pilot is the students have all come back and say, wow, that was really a great resource. That was really helpful. It helped me to see things in a different perspective. And so that's been great. The one thing we have had concerns around for students using the technology is also around plagiarism. Mm-hmm. And so that's the other piece. We talk about the ethical component of that. We want to teach students how to use these tools in an ethical way. And so one of the things we say at LAPU is that we want students to give credit where credit is due, and all that they do. And so that's kind of our fundamental. And so if they're engaging with Spark in the class, we want them to give credit to just list that's where they got that resource. And so the other thing too that we've been working with students on is, again, just acknowledging that there are tools out there that students are going to be using that have generative AI, and helping them to use those tools responsible by having some conversations around how they're using the tools, and really assisting students to use those tools for critical thinking. So the other thing about LAPU, most of our rubrics, when you look at our assignments and our discussions, it's all about critical thinking. We want students to be critically thinking and grappling about issues. Our concern, and I think the concern of many in academia, is that students aren't going to be doing that critical thinking anymore. They're going to copy and paste from a source. And so part of our role, I think, is helping students to use those resources, but also to continue to use their active voice and to contribute, and to be really paraphrasing and grappling with all the different resources that they're finding.
Yeah, definitely. And that sort of speaks to, one of the things that you had mentioned earlier is this idea that, that there are safeguards that we put in place. So again, unlike a normal, ChatGPT kind of thing, that the way that these are trained and the way that these are augmented, allows for us to put safeguards in place, so that if a student says to our Spark, like, hey, write an essay for me, it's not going to do that for them. But instead, I like to think of it as almost like digital office hours. It's almost like taking the place of what would happen if in a brick and mortar institution, a student walked into your office hours and said, hey, Dr. Brewer, I don't understand, this particular concept. Can you explain it to me?
You're exactly right. And I think one of the things we found too, Kristen, I teach in the social sciences, but we also were doing this in mathematics. And for some of the math courses, one of the concerns from faculty was that students are going to use this to get the answer, and they're just going to put the answer in. And so we've had to train a little bit, or augment a little bit differently with some of those tools, so that it does not respond with just the answer. And so that's been another learning for us as well, with some of our content and some of our courses that might be more heavily focused with quizzes, is thinking through, okay, if we're using that quiz, are students really going to be, doing that doing the work. And again, continuing to focus on critical thinking, which even means that we may need to take a step back in our design process and think things through. I'll give you another example of that. In the social sciences, one of the things we've talked about as well is students using their own active voice and finding unique discussions. So we're looking at our discussions as well. We don't want to do a broad discussion that you could pull from any resource. We want to tailor to the student's experience. So we're trying to more customize and tailor our discussions so that we get the students, because again, we want to hear their active voice. We certainly do not want them just copying and pasting into a discussion. And so that's a piece of it too, is how can we augment or change those questions in a way that it helps the students to really share their story and personalize what they're sharing.
Yeah. And I think that's right. Like the advent of sort of AI really forces us as educators and as instructional designers to look at how we're creating assignments, right? Like you really have to ask yourself, well, what is the student learning objective here?
Yes.
And and how do I create a better assignment? So again, quizzes, as you say, like that, what is that really demonstrating? What is that really, is that demonstrating learning? Is it demonstrating durable learning? Is it demonstrating, as you said, critical thinking? So again, how are we, being challenged to create better assignments that so it's not that we're trying to game the system and trying to be better than our students and say, oh, how do we keep them from cheating? But it's more, how do we make better assignments that are really going to assess what we want to assess and assess that learning. Yeah.
Yeah. It's really about critical thinking, I think, again, Kristen, thinking through our rubrics too, and changing some of our rubrics potentially to focus more on that critical thinking component as well, because again, our focus, how students find information. There's so many different generative AI tools out there, and so for us as an institution, we're not saying no, don't use those tools, because we know our students are going to need to be familiar with those tools to be successful in their careers. That's what all the research is pointing to, and so rather we're saying, okay, we know that you're going to be using these tools. Let's help you. Let's partner with you to make sure that you're doing it ethically and doing it in the right way. And then let's tailor our curriculum, like you're pointing out, Kristen, so that it aligns with that. Right. That students do have those opportunities to engage in that critical thinking and that learning.
Yeah, I just remember, I'm old enough to remember back in the day when, when instructors used to tell us, don't use the internet. You can't use any internet sources, and how the advent of the internet just revolutionized the way that teaching and learning was happening. And I think we're seeing that again with AI. So nowadays, you would never, as an instructor, say, don't use the internet, right? We were just taught how to use the internet and how to use it, as you say, like ethically and responsibly, and still keep our own, privilege our own education with that. So yeah.
That's a great example, Kristen. Just thinking about how the internet has revolutionized everything that we do. And I think generative AI is along the same lines, Kristen. From everything I'm reading and I'm looking at, it is going to revolutionize everything we do in a similar way that the internet did.
Yeah.
And so we're just seeing dramatic changes across different disciplines, and it's been fascinating to watch. And in higher ed, we typically tend to be a little bit slower at adopting technologies.
Definitely. Yeah.
So we're also trying to look to other companies and partnering with them, like Nectar is an example. We're partnering with other organizations in order to do some of this the piloting that we're doing, because they're a little bit ahead of higher ed. And so we're just trying to keep up with the curve. Our hope is that some of the things that we're doing might be helpful for other faculty and administrators at other institutions that are grappling with how do we integrate generative AI. Our hope is that this might be helpful. We do a lot of different pilots, and then we spend a lot of time looking back and trying to quantify the impact that it had. And so evidence-based practice is big at LAPU. And so we want the evidence. We want to say, okay, how do we know that really made a difference or had an impact? And so we've got a number of studies that we're doing to quantify that better.
Yeah. And one of the things that I appreciate about what LAPU is doing also is the fact that things move very fast here. So faster than any other institution where I've ever worked, where things don't sit in committee for a long time, when decisions are made, like let's go forward with this, and as you say, let's figure it out, and then we can gather the data and study that data, which I really appreciate, because as you say, I know we're talking about this will revolutionize, but I would even say it's here, it's already, so we can't really be wasting as educators a lot of time thinking about the theoretical implications of things. I think it's important, as you're doing in your classes, to just jump in and to say, let's try this and get student feedback and instructor feedback and see what's going to work.
And we can do that. As a small private institution, there's not a lot of bureaucracy that we have to, or red tape to get through. And so that's our competitive advantage as a small institution. And we have this amazing director, Dr. George Hanshaw, who continues to push us to continually be looking at what's happening in terms of current trends, to continually be piloting things. So again, that's our competitive advantage as a small private institution, is that we can do these things. Yeah. And again, our hope is that as we begin piloting these things and sharing what we're learning, that might be helpful to other institutions as well, as they begin to grapple with these same issues.
And I think our students really benefit because, as you pointed out earlier, we have programs that are very vocational. We don't have a lot of the sort of more theoretical philosophy degrees and history degrees. It's really, geared towards vocation and geared towards that practicality. So using, Spark as we do allows for students to get hands-on experience in a way that is not practical to do in person. So, from a psychology perspective, as you said, it's not just, hey, they can work with children, but they can work with, create a child who has, this learning disability or has this, these emotional issues or, has certain blocks, or and you can program in, sort of personality traits. So that, instead of just kind of working, back in the 80s playing computer chess, that these have real nuance to them.
Yes.
And you can create, because you don't want to put undergraduates in vulnerable populations, No. So this is given a really great opportunity, I think, for students to get a practical hands-on experience in a way that they normally, would not be able to do.
Absolutely. And kind of going back to that internet example, Kristen, we want our students, when they come out of our program, we want them, again, to be familiar with the current tools and be prepared for career success. And by doing this, I think we are benefiting our students. And that was the critical crux of the discussion was, okay, what's the best for our students? Mm-hmm. And at LEP, the other thing is we attempt to be radically student-centered in all we do. And that just means when we're making decisions, we put students first and say, okay, well, what's going to impact the student? And then we go from there. And in this case, we just felt like, we cannot not educate our students on generative AI and provide them the opportunities to experiment with these tools when we know that that's going to benefit them career-wise. And so I'm glad that we've had an opportunity to move forward with a number of different pilots, and they've been really positive as well. And I think we're just continuing to see the positive impact that generative AI can play in higher education, and still grappling with, what does that look like and how do we, so we're still addressing the ethical issues and having those conversations while we're engaged in a lot of these pilots moving forward.
Yeah, because we can ask students, we can get feedback from instructors so rather than, as I said, just doing things on the theoretical side and trying to figure out, hey, what do we think might maybe perhaps work? We do it and then say to the students, well, how did that work for you? How did that feel? To the instructors, how did that work? How did that feel? And as you also pointed out, gathering data about this to be very sort of data driven in the way that we make these, and hopefully, as you also mentioned, being able to help other institutions who might not have the level of transparency that we do here, so that we're able to kind of do things quickly and efficiently. So yeah. So, and what have you found that your students have said? Like, what sort of feedback I mean, I know you're an assistant dean for us. So what are your faculty saying to you? What are your students saying to you about, our course assistants and these, characters that we work with, the AI characters? What feedback are you getting?
Yeah, I think it's mixed to some extent. I think I had shared the one concern amongst our faculty, again, continues to be they want students to do the critical thinking, and they just want to ensure that students aren't going to copy and paste from the resource. And so we've continued to have some discussions around that. But in general, when you look at the student responses, it really changes the whole dynamic for a student, because just think about it as 24/7 support. With what we're integrating and going back to the having Spark, right, in that room, that means at 9:00 at night, if they've got to finish a paper, and our students, I should talk about our student demographic too. Mm-hmm. Our students are working professionals in a fully online environment. Many of them have just a lot of different obligations, and they're trying to balance all of these different things. And so oftentimes they may not have the time to get to an assignment. And then when they do, they've got a short window to get it complete. And so in this case, even if they can't reach me as the instructor, they can have that conversation. And so for our students, many of them have said it's really just been great to have that tool and that resource for when I need it. It's kind of, we've talked about on demand, Kristen, and how, students want information right now. If they do a submission, they want it graded quickly. Yeah. That's just part of our culture. And I think by integrating this resource, it's really helped to bridge that gap for a lot of our students. And they've just felt grateful that they've got an additional tool to provide them support. And some of the comments too, that students have been a little surprised at the tool's ability to engage with them. And they kind of thought, okay, this is just going to be me posing a question. But I think the dynamic part of it, where Spark actually asked them a question back to get more feedback, that part, and that blows my mind too. That really is like, wow.
It's Socratic, like I said, as if you were really in your professor's office, yes, having a Socratic conversation, with your instructor. Yeah.
So it's really powerful, and it's on demand anytime for them to do, 24/7. Yeah. So, and I think that's the way we're headed as an institution too. We're looking at how higher education is going to be changing, and student interest and needs, and looking at that kind of on-demand model and trying to figure out how do we respond in ways that students are looking for, versus kind of the traditional model. We build it and they come. Today's a new day, and students have so many different opportunities, and there's so many different institutions that they can attend, that for us, we continue to think about, okay, how can we compete in this marketplace? And one of the ways that we compete is by this personalized attention to students. That's a big focus that we have. And also our focus on just preparing them for career success, providing them access to all the tools that they're going to need to be successful. So this is all part of a bigger strategy, I think, for LAPU.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And as you sort of alluded to, just removing those barriers to education that adult non-traditional learners often have. Yes. That, if you're a traditional undergraduate, you attend a brick and mortar institution where this is your full-time job, and your professor's there at the same time you are, and you can pop by and grab coffee with them. And our students don't have that same experience. So I think you're absolutely right that one of the things that the AI can do in the way that we're integrating it. So we're not, again, just talking about just like generally how is generative AI doing this, but specifically how we are integrating it into our classrooms and into our assignments, can really remove those barriers to education.
Yes, and we're hoping that we can make the education to be more dynamic and engaging for students as well. And I think this is one tool that's certainly gonna help with this. But education's evolving, and we're continually thinking about how do we, in an asynchronous environment, how do we create community? What does that look like?
Community is huge in an asynchronous, right? Because you maybe drop into a discussion and you kind of say like, hey, I don't know if you've seen that meme that's like, I like bread. Craig, I see you like bread. I like bread too. So sometimes the discussions aren't as necessarily, as you say, as dynamic as they could be. But I think with the integration of Spark and our sort of personalized, class assistants and things like that can really hopefully, raise up that level of discourse in our classes.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And have you found that it has sort of freed you up to have higher level conversations with students?
I have. Absolutely. I think some of the fundamental questions that I formally got from teaching this, and again, I'm just speaking anecdotally, on my
Sure.
behalf, but I'm probably at 25 students, every 8 weeks. What I've noticed, one of the things I've noticed is that the questions that I'm getting are a little bit different. Yeah. And so formally, I would get, I would say kind of some questions that anyone could answer. The timing of something, the requirements of an assignment, those are going away. And now I'm getting bigger questions where students are actually having some of those dialogues and grappling with it and saying, okay, this is what I'm struggling with. And as a faculty member, that's just amazing, because it means they've already done critical thinking. They've already grappled with the issue. And now I get to come alongside of them at that point. And so it allows me, from a timing perspective, just to be able to rely on another source on the fundamentals for students. Right. And then when it gets to a higher level, I can be available and we can have some of those discussions. So it doesn't replace the instructor at all, but it augments, or, it's just an additional resource and support, I think, moving forward to just help balance that and provide students with quick responses to easy questions. And on the bigger questions, the deeper philosophical questions, then I see those. It's like, okay, let's spend some time to connect. But for me, it's really a blessing, because I'm not starting at kind of the very beginning with students. Oftentimes now they've already done some of that work. And so they're already aware of some of the concepts before we even have a discussion.
Yeah. I like to think of it as like grocery delivery services or grocery pickup, right? That you have more time to really think about the cooking and the creation of a meal when you're not having to spend the time walking through a grocery store. And so it just speaks to this larger in our society, hopefully automating some of the more mundane tasks so that we are freed up to be able. So again, I push back against people that say, oh, AI is replacing higher level thinking. AI is replacing, critical thinking. And I would say my hope is that no, it's the opposite, that this can now free us up as instructors to be able to have, because again, you're not answering, 25 emails of saying, wait, when's this due? Where do I submit this? Because hopefully that's something that they can ask their online course assistant. And in a way that also removes the shame also, because they're like, oh my gosh, my professor already explained this to me. I don't want to ask again. But there's no shame, right? Because if they're like, this is such a fundamental concept, I don't want to ask my professor. I'm going to feel dumb if I ask my classmates or if I ask my instructor. But it removes that shame. And again, it levels that playing field.
That's a great point, Kristen. And they can ask. And even when they're talking to me, I think a lot of students are fearful about asking a question that might be perceived as a dumb question.
Yeah.
Well, with this generative AI tool, they can ask anything that they want, right? Yeah. And have that dialogue freely. And so I think that that's also really significant, because again, traditionally in higher ed, there's this power dynamic and students don't always feel comfortable sharing those questions. And so what a great resource to be able to say, you can ask whatever you want. And it's not going to impact the student. Their concern is if they ask the instructor something, now I'm going to think different of them. With this tool, there's no impact on how they might be perceived by the instructor. So I think that's another significant strength.
Yeah. And obviously with like adult learners, these are professionals in their own fields. These are not, an 18-year-old who was in high school last week. These are people who are managers at their jobs. They're respected in their jobs. So it's such as you say, a power shift to feel like I'm not used to not knowing what I'm doing. I'm not used to not being competent in my field. And maybe I'm not going to ask the question because I'm embarrassed about the fact that I should know this, but I haven't been in school in 10, 15 years. And I don't remember how to be a student. So I think that those little things like that, being able to just without any shame, without any judgment, being able to interact with the like an online teaching assistant like that. Like we have integrated into every one of our classes. And for those of you that are not at LAPU, our Spark, our online teaching assistant, as I said, which is specifically trained, augmented for each individual class. And it shows up every week in their kind of weekly overview. It's right there. So it's just, constantly reminding students, hey, it's here. And it's here to help you and to support you. And yeah, and I think it's really making a difference. Yeah.
And one of the things that we've done as well, Kristen, part of it's just partnering with our faculty too, and helping them to become more familiar with the tools so that they're comfortable encouraging our students to use those tools. So at LAPU, for the last 2 years, we've had so many professional development training opportunities, and they've all been geared towards really AI, because that is the hot topic of our time. Yeah. That's the conversations our faculty want to have. We ask our faculty, what can we talk about in this upcoming professional development? They continue to come back with, we want to learn more about AI and the impact that it has on students. They want to talk about the ethical concerns that they have. So we've been working to create those spaces for our faculty to have those discussions as well.
Yeah. And we found that our faculty can, have reported back like, oh, yes, I think AI is really important. Yes, I think it's great. But then faculty report that they don't use it themselves a lot.
Yes.
Because I think in academia, there is a certain stigma attached to using AI yourself. Right. Because you're like, oh, yeah, but I have a doctorate. I don't need to use AI. So even removing some of that, the stigma that's associated with.
And we can model that too, Kristen. I'm thinking our chief academic officer, Dr. Wayne Herman, on a big report that we had, he used generative AI to summarize it. And then he sent it out to us and said, hey, I use generative AI and I summarize. So part of it too, I think for us as academic leaders is we can begin using those tools and sharing that to take away that sense of shame. I know I felt that at first when I was using ChatGPT. I'm like, oh, is this ethical? Am I being honest and kind of?
I should know this. I should do this myself, right?
Yes. Yeah. And so I think when my supervisor began sharing with me how he was using these tools in his work, it really freed me up to begin doing the same with my direct reports. And so I think that's part of it. It's a cultural shift. And if we can get leaders on board that begin modeling how to use some of these tools, I think it takes away a lot of that concern and the stigma around it.
Yeah. Yeah. So even like we say, it's happening all over in professions. Like, should a professional chef, use a microwave? It's these tools are available, and, it's okay to embrace change, because our students are doing it. So,
yes.
Yeah, definitely. All right. If anybody has any questions, I don't know, we're sort of monitoring the chat right now. If anybody has any questions or anything that they want to ask Dr. Brewer, or any other sort of closing thoughts that you have for us today?
So, thank you so much, Kristen, for partnering on this presentation this morning. I think in closing, my encouragement for folks in higher ed and in academia is just to begin to experiment with some of the tools. They are amazing. And like I said, I've been experimenting a lot in this last year and have just learned so much. And again, I just encourage you to do the same and to partner with us as an institution too. LAPU is always looking to partner with other institutions as we begin piloting some of these things. So if you're interested in doing a pilot or talking with us about some of these pilots, we'd love to have those conversations with you and to connect with you.
Yeah. And also to utilize, what we're doing with our AI center, that we, if anybody ever wants to publish with us or work with us, our AI center has some fantastic resources for professors and institutions. Yeah. All right. Okay. Well, thank you again, Dr. Craig Brewer, so much for your time today. And I look forward to, to talking with you in the future.
Great. Thank you so much, Kristen. I hope everyone has a great day.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody. All right. Bye.